So continuing on from our last video, let's look in more detail at the World Trade Organization, and in particular, both the benefits and the controversy which have surrounded this particular organization. If we start with the benefits, certainly there are a number, and even the critics of the WTO will acknowledge a number of these. Certainly, the system does promote peace. Whether it achieves it or not is another thing, but it certainly promotes peace. It promotes harmony and cooperation around the globe, which is, of course, a good thing. The rules which are imposed by the WTO should at least make life easier for everyone. You know, if there weren't any rules, that's when things can get out of hand and become complicated. Having those guidelines there, and also importantly an organisation to police them, certainly makes it easier to conduct business, especially when it comes to resolving disputes. The free trade, which we've seen emerge with the assistance from the WTO, also cuts the cost of living for everyone, and this can be seen in a number of different industries as key examples. So if we look at the telecommunications industry, even by 1997, which is over 20 years ago now, 68 countries encompassing 90% of the world telecommunications revenues pledged to open their market to fair competition. So in countries both here in Australia and all around the world, it's now much easier for us to gain access to wonderful Snapchats like this, as well as other forms of communication. It's very much, we take this for granted today, but it wasn't always so easy to communicate all across the globe. If we look at the financial services industry, again by 1997, 102 countries covering 95% of the financial services market had pledged to open their markets at least to varying degrees, and this is why we now see Alec Baldwin and his friends from Latitude Financial on every second ad on the TV. They've been able to come in, like many other financial services firms, into Australia and many markets around the world. We've also seen greater choice in products, as we discussed in previous weeks. Free trade allows this, obviously, and not only means that people can specialise in a greater variety of different products, but it's obviously just easier to sell them around the world now, which means greater choice for us as consumers. Trade also does stimulate economic growth, as outlined by a number of our key trade theories, and also encourages good government without the need to necessarily impose some of these anti-consumer based trade instruments that we talked about in the last couple of videos. Of course, there are two sides to every story, and there have been a number of controversies surrounding the WTO as well. Perhaps the most prominent, and certainly the most publicised, occurred in Seattle in the round that was held there in 1999. Now, this Millennium Round was aimed, like many before it, at further reduction of trade barriers, and here they focused on agriculture and services, continuing on from the last few rounds of the GATT. It was, however, the meeting was disrupted by a number of different groups, including human rights groups, trade unions, environmentalists, and even anti-globalisation groups, as you can see as depicted in the image in the bottom right of your screen. Unfortunately, to say things got a little out of hand with these protesting groups would be to vastly understate what happened. That looks like a scene from a movie, but that is actual footage of the conflict that occurred between the police, the riot police, and the protest groups in Seattle that year. And obviously, once this started to happen and there was this public fighting on the streets, not much was actually done, and certainly no overall agreement was reached. In fact, most of the discussion was around the protests and the conflict with the police rather than the actual discussions themselves. So why were there so many groups who were protesting against the WTO in Seattle, and to be honest, at every other meeting of the WTO ever since? Well, certainly the anti-WTO groups, including Michael Moore and his friends, will argue that a global system of enforceable rules is being created, and that is absolutely the truth. The WTO will tell you as much, where corporations are said to have all the rights, according to the critics, governments have all the obligations and democracy is simply left behind in the dust. So the concern here is that all the power is being shifted from the governments to the corporations, and that may not necessarily be in the best interests of us as individuals within a society, or even from a government perspective. There's also concern over the intellectual property rights and whether it's actually a good thing for firms to be able to do or have ownership over certain key intellectual property. And this is especially the case in terms of key medical breakthroughs. So if we look, for example, at the situation in Africa, where we're seeing more than 25 million people diagnosed with HIV or AIDS, and 17 million people have died. Now, there's been a lot of research that's currently being undertaken in terms of developing a vaccine for HIV, and some companies are claiming to be very close to having a finalised product which is all said to be able to achieve that. But it then begs the question whether those companies, individual companies, should be able to fully own the rights to this significant breakthrough. Shouldn't governments have some ability to use that intellectual property for the good of the overall country, rather than just a single company being able to market it and sell it and make as much money potentially as they like off it? So the question of who should have the control over that particular intellectual property does start to become a key question. Alright, to finish our discussion on the WTO, we're going to look at the latest round of discussions, which are known as the Doha round. Now, not surprisingly, this is because this round of discussions has been held in Doha, which is the capital city of Qatar, and as you can see in the top right corner is a very, very modern, very vibrant city where they have some unusual pets, I think you could say, and some even more unusual potholes. You don't want to miss that little divot in the road, do you? The Doha round of discussions for the WTO began in 2001 and was supposed to only go for 3 years, but are still going. There's no agreement which has been reached to date. Some of the key issues that are under examination here include further reducing those tariffs on industrial goods and services, the further phasing out of subsidies, reducing the anti-dumping laws that we've spoken about this week, WTO regulation on intellectual property, whether that should prevent members from protecting public health or not, as we discussed on the last slide, and also new issues, contemporary issues like genetically modified food, the right to that, and the value in that sort of thing. Is it going to solve world hunger? Who should have control over it? And so on. These are some of the key issues that you guys will have to deal with as the international business managers of the future.